Freedom Act, standing in the name of Mr. Adler at report stage.
Ruling by the Speaker, Wednesday, April 22nd, 2015. Bill S-219, Projet de loi S-200.
Bill S-219.
Commemoration of the exodus of Vietnamese refugees and their acceptance in Canada after the fall of Saigon and the end of the Vietnam War. Loi instituant une journée nationale de
An act respecting a national day of commemoration of the exodus of Vietnamese refugees and their acceptance in Canada after the fall of Saigon and the end of the Vietnam War.
There are three motions in amendment standing on the notice paper for the report stage of Bill S-219. Les motions numéro 1.
Motions numbered 1 and 2 will not be selected by the Chair, as they could have been presented in committee.
Motion number 3 will be debated and voted upon.
I will now propose motion number 3 to the House.
Monsieur Pachetti, seconded by Madame May, moves that Bill S-219 be amended by deleting Clause 2. Debate. The Honourable Member for Saint Leonard, Saint Michel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I understand that this bill is slightly controversial, but I think everybody is in favour. And I'm pleased to rise today to speak to my proposed amendment. I know I had proposed various amendments, and they were actually all for the same reason. We're talking on Bill S-219, which again is the Journey to Freedom Act from the outset. I'd like to say that I'm not opposed to this bill, and all my proposed amendments, the ones that were deleting lines 7 to 13 of the preamble on page 1, and the one proposing to delete lines 16 to 30 of the preamble on page 2 that you ruled out of order, and the one that you actually accepted in deleting clause 2, are due to the fact that these clauses all contain April 30th as the date to mark the Journey to Freedom Day. And as we heard in committee, there is no consensus within the Vietnamese community that the date is appropriate. The purpose of these deletions is to allow the bill to pass while providing the government an opportunity to go back and consult with the Vietnamese Canadian community and select a date upon which a broad consensus exists. The reason consensus does not exist is because April 30th, as the anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War, it would make Journey to Freedom Day synonymous with a historical event that Canada did not play a significant role in. Secondly, it would take away focus from Canada's role in setting displaced Vietnamese people and place it on the many points of contention surrounding the Vietnam War. And thirdly, risks making Journey to Freedom Day a political statement rather when it should not. It would be unfortunate if Parliament passed this bill only for it to sow division. We would instead seek to create a uniquely Canadian day to commemorate the Vietnamese community's acceptance into Canada and their achievements thereafter. I can propose a few dates, but these are dates that we got from reading the minutes at committee and through speaking to some of my constituents. For example, July 27th is a possible alternative because it is the day that Canadian National Defence Operation Magnet 2 began its flights of displaced Vietnamese people, also known as boat people, to bring them here to Canada. May 1st is also a possible alternative because it is the day that the Canadian government declared it would sponsor refugees with relatives already in Canada. And of course, there's June 30th is a possible alternative because every year the United Nations, which I think is important, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees marks World Refugee Day on June 20th. And on June 20th, 1986, the Nansen Refugee Award was awarded to the people of Canada by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, due in large part to Canada's role in welcoming Vietnamese refugees into Canada. But I, Mr. Speaker, don't want to say that I have a preference for any of these dates because, again, that would be contradictory to my first statement, which I would prefer to have the Vietnamese community, along with the government, decide on a consensual date where everybody would be happy. I've always believed that one of the greatest humanitarian contributions we can make in times of international crisis is to open our borders in order to welcome those who are forced to escape perilous circumstances abroad. Journey to Freedom Day has the potential to celebrate such notable actions quite admirably. It can also highlight the positive impact that Canada made during a time of crisis. by virtue of being a welcoming and compassionate nation while celebrating the numerous achievements by Vietnamese Canadians that have enriched Canada ever since. Making these the exclusive focus of the Journey to Freedom Act would be the most beneficial, because the day could then serve as a reminder to Canadians that generosity in difficult times can make a lasting impact that betters our country and the world we live in. This is why I believe it is important to choose a date that does not obscure these goals in any way or divide Canadians, especially those of Vietnamese origin, and that we can move on constructively. As a personal note, I've received correspondence from Vietnamese in my community, and they're all in favor of the bill. But the controversy, of course, is the date, and that's one of the reasons that I propose that we go back and try and have my amendments pass here in the House, and that we can go back and have the bill approved at third reading in the next couple of weeks before the House rises. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, reprise de débat, the honourable member for York Centre.
I'm happy to rise today to speak on behalf of Bill S-219, the Journey to Freedom Day Act. Speaker, I am co-sponsoring this bill with Senator No from the other place. It's important, however, that we, contrary to what we just heard earlier from the other speaker, that April 30th is designated as the day for Journey to Freedom Day Act. It's important that this is the date that the community has agreed upon. This is the date that the community wants. I presented a petition in the House signed by 2,620 people of Vietnamese Canadian origin here in the House of Commons just a little while ago. I also have, in addition, we had committee hearings at Heritage Committee where we heard from various members of the community, including one such James Nguyen, who is president of the Vietnamese Association of Toronto. And I will quote what he says: "As a leader of the biggest Vietnamese community in Canada, I attend many events, and whenever the conversation of this bill comes up, there is overwhelming support for it. This bill is important to me and those I encounter in the community because it acknowledges our heritage." April 30th is a day for Vietnamese Canadians to come together and express our gratitude to Canada for welcoming us with open arms. Speaker, the community wants April 30th. This is the day the saga of the Vietnamese boat people began. Let's not forget, when April 30th, 1975 was the day the communist forces from North Vietnam occupied and conquered the South. They took over Saigon, and as a result, almost 2 million people fled South Vietnam. They fled persecution, they fled political imprisonment, they fled, in a lot of instances, death. Speaker, some 250,000 boat people who went on the rafts, these rafts that were put together with logs and with rope, across the seas. 250,000 succumbed to murder by pirates, to rape, sexual assault, drowning, thirst, hunger. In 1980, some 120,000 were accepted here in Canada. Canada in 1986 was awarded the Nansen Medal. Speaker, there are some 300,000 Vietnamese Canadians of Vietnamese origin living now in Canada. It is important that the Vietnamese Canadians who all agree that April 30th as a Journey to Freedom Day is a day that is recognized by the community, by this House of Commons. Speaker, it is important. I have many people in my community of Vietnamese origin and have told me April 30th is the day. Speaker, Canada is a country where we all come from somewhere else, and we all come here for pretty much the same reason: to escape persecution, to escape hatred, to escape violence against ourselves. And we come here because we want the opportunity and the hope that Canada has to offer us. Yes, for ourselves, but more importantly for our kids. And Speaker, in the late 70s and 1980, when Canada opened its doors to so many Vietnamese boat people, that boat is a symbol. It is a metaphor for freedom, for journey to freedom. And that is why April 30th, the date that the community wants, the date that Saigon fell to the communist forces. Speaker, so many Canadians don't know the story of Vietnamese boat people. This day, April 30th, the day Saigon fell, the day that began the exodus of people from South Vietnam, the day that Canadians will learn what people will do, what extent they will go to to escape persecution, to embrace freedom for themselves and for their families. Speaker, this is so significant. This is an important date. And I will tell you that the young people here in Canada must know April 30th as the date. This bill will serve a pedagogical purpose. It will educate young Canadians and Canadians alike of the importance of what we have here in Canada, the great Canadian values of freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Speaker, this is also a celebration. This bill is a celebration of Canada. It's a celebration of Canadian values, that we here in Canada in 1980 opened up our arms to welcome boat people, people who had absolutely nothing. My dad was a survivor of the Holocaust, and he came here with only the shirt on his back. Many people, not just Vietnamese, but a lot of people have come to Canada with the very same, just the shirt on their back and some change in their pocket, to make Canada their home, because Canada offers hope and opportunity for people. And Speaker, I will tell you that people in my community want April 30th as the day to mark. 40 years have gone by now, and we have an opportunity in this House to do the right thing, to say to the Vietnamese Canadian community, yes, Saigon fell on April 30th. That's the day that the journey to freedom began, which ended up here in Canada, where now some 300,000 Canadians of Vietnamese origin live. On the weekend, I was at the North York Vietnamese Seniors Club, and there were many people there, both young and old alike, who came on these makeshift boats. Some came in babes in arms. And all remember the experience, and all are so grateful to Canada. This date is so important for them. We must do the right thing here in Canada. You know, when people say we haven't heard from the community, well, the community has been heard. The community has spoken. The community has said April 30th is the day. Some say, well, we need to hear from the government of Vietnam or their representatives. Well, Speaker, it is not the practice of this Parliament nor any other democratic parliament around the world to hear from representatives of foreign governments when it comes to passing domestic legislation, and we should not bend to that pressure from that embassy or any other embassy. When we pass legislation in this House, it is because the will of the people have elected us to do that. And we are responsible to the Canadian people, not to the people in another country. And Speaker, Vietnamese Canadians have spoken. They have sent many of us here, just like other Canadians, to get the job done. And the job in this piece of legislation is to designate April 30th as the Journey to Freedom Day Act. Thank you, Speaker.
Reprise de débat, resuming debate. L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Brossard-la-Prairie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess I'm not allowed to ask a question.
Today to speak about Bill S-219, and I just listened to what the sponsor of the bill has just said, and I'd just like to clarify when the member said that he speaks on behalf of the community. You know, being a member of Vietnamese origin, I can say that I've listened to what the community has said, and to be honest, Mr. Speaker, I think the member is not listening to what everyone has to say. It is a divisive bill. I'm not saying that the April 30th is not the right date, but what I'm saying is that it's not that unanimous. People are it created a division, and I find it very unfortunate that you know, one of the way we could have gone forward, bringing the Vietnamese community together, was to bring something that was more, really more concrete. You know, I've heard and I've listened to a lot of people in my riding of Vietnamese community, from the Vietnamese community, who have told me that one of the main issue for them is human rights issue in Vietnam. And what we're doing here is we're not even addressing that issue. I've heard a lot of comments when we talked about the bill, or when the senator talked about the bill. There's no specific things that was brought forward in order to really deal with the issues that affect people in Vietnam. And yesterday, Mr. Speaker, there was in this House there was the subcommittee for international human rights that actually is looking into human rights situation in Vietnam. And they heard from Viet Tan, for instance, an organization that actually spoke about some of the issues that Vietnamese have to deal with. And I'll read you, from the colleague on the other side, from the member of Fleetwood Port Kells, a conservative member who yesterday at the committee said, "The Vietnamese government continues to be a violator in a broad area of human rights and is among the worst violators of religious freedom in the world. The international community must exert pressure on the Vietnamese government to cease these abuses against its own citizens." Even when we hear alarm bells coming from the conservatives, the only thing they can come up with is a bill that actually, what, Mr. Speaker, I'll read to you the bill. There's only 3 articles of it. So the first one is, "This act may be cited as the Journey to Freedom Day Act." That's the short title. Number 2, throughout Canada, in each and every year, the 30th day of April shall be known as Journey to Freedom Day. And article number 3, the last one, "For greater certainty, Journey to Freedom Day is not a legal holiday or a non-judicial day." So with all of that, these are the only article that will stay after the bill is adopted. So all the discussion about the preamble, all the divisiveness that has come up from some of the rhetoric that we heard from all parties, not all parties, sorry, from all sides, those issues will not be, and just to be clear, there will not be in the final text of the legislation. So instead of using a tool or a bill to actually bring the Vietnamese together, what the Conservatives have done is actually divide the Vietnamese community. And so yes, we've heard from people who actually left, and to be honest, I'll be clear, Mr. Speaker, I will be supporting the bill. I've voted on the 2nd reading for the bill, and I'll vote for it at the 3rd reading. But what I'm saying about what the government could have done, for instance, or what the member could have done, is, for instance, there's a big rally regarding fundraising for the Vietnamese Boat People Museum. This is a way of learning about the history of Vietnam, what happened after April 30th, and actually it'll be the 40th year this year, 40th anniversary. And there's so many stories about Vietnamese people, boat people leaving Vietnam. For instance, I'll invite all the members here to actually watch the documentary that it's called Bolinao 52. It's a documentary that actually deals with, it follows a group of boat people through their journey. And why 52? Because 52 out of 110 people survived. So the rest of them died. So there's a lot of ways for us as member of parliaments and for the government to actually bring forward tools for other generations to actually know about what happened. And to be honest, when I saw the documentary, I watched it with my mother. It was organized as a fundraiser for the Vietnamese museum, and I think that's one way of bringing people together. Everyone agrees that we have to, remember our roots. In my case, my Vietnamese roots are really part of who I am, and it's really important for me to learn about it. But when we have a bill that actually doesn't say much and actually doesn't do much, because to be honest, Mr. Speaker, I agree with the member when he said that April 30th is already a day where people in the community are celebrating. And for instance, this weekend, I'll be going in Montreal celebrating the April 30th day. For me, it's different. I mean, everyone has a version, or everyone understands the day, sees the days differently. For me, it's more a date for me to remember my roots, to commemorate all the sacrifice that my parents have done in order to come to Canada and actually for me to be here today in the House. So I think what could have been done is a way to bring people together. And I mentioned human rights in Vietnam, Mr. Speaker. The reason why I'm mentioning human rights in Vietnam is because right now what has been done is just basically bringing an issue that, again, is divisive, but not getting anything in return. We've seen this government when they deal with the government deals with a trade agreement. I'll give you the example of Honduras. The reason why the NDP opposed it is because when the government actually dealt and negotiated the agreement, they never talked about human rights. And human rights in Honduras, you know, it's not the best place on earth in terms of protecting human rights. But when the government actually had a deal, could actually talk about human rights and negotiate human rights, they didn't do it. And it's the same thing with the Liberals, who actually supported, and what we get from the other side is basically, let's negotiate trade agreement, let's help economic development, and after that, you know, eventually everything will be cleared up, and human rights issues will be resolved. But at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, we have to negotiate now. The reason why I'm talking about this, if you would listen, is that right now we are talking about there are negotiations regarding Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And we haven't heard the government talk about human rights when we talk about negotiations. And that's what people in Vietnam and people who actually live here, people from the community, if the member who's heckling right now would have really listened to what the community is saying, is really we need to help people in Vietnam. So what we're talking about is a bill that is divisive, but that is not bringing things forward, that is not helping people in Vietnam. And that's why what we're offering on this side is solutions. And right now the solution, Mr. Speaker, is there are negotiations, there are talks. And I invite the member who's heckling over there just to listen to the subcommittee meeting yesterday. There was a subcommittee in Parliament regarding human rights in Vietnam, and you know, before coming here, I actually watched the whole thing. I listened to it, and for me, it's important. So it's ways of bringing things forward, making sure that we don't forget our past, and this is for me, Mr. Speaker, is really important because it's part of who I am, and that's why I was mentioning to the member heckling on the other side. Instead of bringing something that is so divisive, why not help, for instance, the Vietnamese Museum of Boat People? Why not help people in Vietnam right now? So that would have been a way to bring all the people together. That would have been a way to move forward. That would have been a way to actually improve things, not just here, but in other countries. You know, again, you know, the bill that we have here today is being used sort of as a tool, and it is unfortunate. But I told you, Mr. Speaker, I do understand that people in my riding and people from the community, some of them, it's too easy to generalize saying all the communities is united against for it or against it. We understand the differences. As I said, for me, it's a way to remember my roots, remember my origins, remember where my parents came from, remember people from Vietnam, and yes, it is a way for me to see how great it is for us to live in this country, in Canada, where they actually open up the door and where people of different origins are welcome. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, reprise de débat, the honourable member for York West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to begin by acknowledging my colleague, the previous speaker, who frankly said it all. He outlined his concerns about it, as I have, and I imagine many have. That the government continues to use important communities like this, frankly, as nothing more than wedges to divide communities, not to build communities. We have to understand what our role is as parliamentarians. And frankly, it is about uniting people. It's about helping communities get strong and build. It is about helping communities go forward and celebrating special days within that community. But the way you do that is by consultation, and that means thorough and proper consultation. What this bill has done, as my NDP colleague has pointed out, it has divided the community immensely. So rather than have them united, as my Conservative colleague, the mover of the bill, would have you think that everybody was in agreement, well, if everybody was in agreement, then we would all be very happy today to deal with this bill at this point. The problem is all are not happy. Now, you never get 100% at any given time on an issue. But there are as many people against this as there appears to be for this. So those of us who represent a large Vietnamese community in particular have, of course, been bombarded with all sides of this issue. And so when I'm speaking to it today, it's of mixed feelings on both sides, because it's a community that I represent. I happen to work a lot with the Vietnamese community. I support them immensely. And when they're flagging all these issues about don't vote for 219 because it's not the right day, the senator changed the title, which they were satisfied with, but there was very limited consultation, both at the Senate level. I believe there was one day when it was at the Senate, and when it was here, it was again very limited debate and discussion at committee. Many of the people that have written to me and talked to me have said they wanted to get to the committee, but it wasn't even listed on the parliamentary agenda when it was coming up, so it suddenly appeared on the agenda. They didn't have time to get up here, and when some of them did come up very quickly for the meeting, they were denied the opportunity to speak because there's only so much time. So that's the way the government plays the wedge politics of pitting one part of a community against another. It doesn't give time for full discussion. What is the problem with taking extra time to make sure that we as parliamentarians get it right, so that we can support a bill that unites a community? I think the goal may have been right, but more time needed to be taken to ensure that we got it right, which is why it gives many of us such difficulty in trying to figure out how to deal with this bill. I want to recognize my colleague, the critic, and in his position. And again, we all had that same trying to do what's right, but what's right for everybody, not just what's right for a handful of people that suit the government's requirements. We want to do something that's right for everybody. And as I said, I've had so many emails and so many petitions and all of that asking that we recognize it as a day of celebration, but not April the 30th. There have been lots and lots of correspondence for everybody in this. And as their MP, I've come to know the community very well, as I mentioned, and to honor them as we go forward. I will be part of a special celebration, or a commemoration is the right word, not celebration, which is part of my issue. This coming Saturday, which I have been at for many, many years, at Nathan Phillips Square, where I speak to many of the hundreds of veterans that are there to remember what happened on that day, and to remember the over 250,000 Vietnamese that died fleeing that regime, that died of starvation or died in the ocean or whatever. It's a commemoration like Remembrance Day. It's a day of sadness that you remember what happened. The community that I'm talking to want to see a day that is a day of celebration, a celebration of all the positive things that have happened as a result of the Vietnamese community coming to Canada, the successful families that they have raised, the businesses that are now operated by successful Vietnamese members of the community. They want a day to celebrate and think it's a great honor to have a day to celebrate all of the achievements that have happened in this country that they now call home. But April 30th, as the senator initially had for the name of the day, right, was a black day because it's a day of sadness. It's not April 30th is not a day you celebrate all the great things that the Vietnamese community have done in Canada. It's a day that you remember the fall of Saigon and the ultimate exodus of thousands and thousands of refugees from Vietnam. So it's a day that we always celebrate at Nathan Phillips Square and in other places as a day of sadness and a day of acknowledging the many men and women that live in Canada that were part of the military that fled, that stand there in uniform and remember that day as a day of sadness. I believe what the community would like to have is a day to celebrate the Vietnamese community. That's a day that I would love to see us happen. And that's where the concern is, that the day is being a black day rather than a day of celebration, which is why I'm having tremendous concerns on how to deal with this issue. It's a private member's bill, so clearly we're able to represent our constituents as to how they feel and what they want us to do. And a lot of the people in my riding clearly are not happy with the idea of it going forward with the April 30th date. But as my colleagues have indicated earlier, that's the only date that's on this bill. But this bill really says very little. It has 3 lines. It doesn't achieve anything except quite possibly allow the government to continue their wedge politics, which is dividing communities. You're with us or you're not with us, even though your concerns are very, very legitimate as we move forward. And again, most of them that are concerned are saying this is a day of sadness. It's like Remembrance Day for us here in Canada. And this is not a day to celebrate all of the great things that the Vietnamese community has done, has worked for. The Vietnamese community in Canada is made up of people who are fiercely and rightly proud of their history. They work hard and in many cases continue to fight for the true freedom and democracy in their homeland. I attended the Human Rights Subcommittee yesterday and heard the head of the Viet Thanh organization talk about the atrocities that continue to happen in Vietnam when you talk about human rights violations, talking about the amount of human trafficking going on in those communities. Those are issues, frankly, that we really need to be pushing forward, moving along, to try to make sure that we are helping a community that we very much respect and attribute. But is April 30th the right day? I would have preferred to have seen the bill sent back to committee and had allocated some more time to hearing more of the residents on all sides of the issue and try to do what we're supposed to do in Parliament on things like this, which is to find a way to bring the community together, to unite the community. I have no doubt we could have done that, but unfortunately, because there was insufficient time, that didn't happen. So as I said, April 30th is widely seen by the Vietnamese Canadian community as a dark day, like November the 11th is for us for remembrance. I would like to see us have a day to celebrate the Vietnamese community and the wonderful work that they continue to build our community, to strengthen our community, and help us continue the positive things that we are doing. So, Mr. Speaker, we're going forward with a difficult piece of legislation that is tearing the community apart on all sides. I certainly would have liked it gone back if that was an option. The procedures may not allow that to happen at this particular point. But as we move forward and trying to say what else can we be doing to assist here, to take away the difficulties between the two sides of this issue, how do we get them all to agree? Well, I think that's going to be extremely difficult to do. And I'm not sure where we would have to go from here to try to make any corrections. But for it to go forward in its current form, I think is a disservice to the Vietnamese community, but does certainly leave us into a very difficult position. But it is a private member's bill, and when the appropriate time comes, we will all have our opportunity to reflect our community's wishes at the time that this comes up for disposition. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, reprise de débat, the honourable member for Thornhill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome this opportunity to rejoin the debate on Bill S-219, the Journey to Freedom Day bill, and to speak in support of the legislation. As you know, Mr. Speaker, the Journey to Freedom Day Act would designate April the 30th as the day to be marked, a day that began the flight of hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese in a mass exodus from their homeland. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that April 30th is the right day to be designated to commemorate the beginning of that exodus. I would respectfully disagree with my colleague, the member from York West, and before her, the NDP member from Brossard-La Prairie, in use of the word divided to describe the sentiment of the Vietnamese Canadian community. On Saturday night, I attended a very large celebration banquet in Toronto, attended by between 600 and 800 Vietnamese Canadians. The evening was titled "Thank You, Canada," and represents the majority faction of Vietnamese Canadians who support this bill, who recognize that April 30th was indeed a tragic day, marking the communist capture of the South Vietnamese capital after decades of civil war in the country. The final capture of Saigon really marked the end of the 1954 Geneva Peace Accord, which divided the country in hopes that there would one day be reconciliation, and instead we saw domination and the oppression that followed by the North Vietnamese regime. For me, April the 30th is of particular importance. I was among the 7,000 who were airlifted out of Saigon on April 30th in the American military operation, Operation Frequent Wind. But even as we left, and the overwhelming majority of those 7,000 were Vietnamese who had reason to fear for their lives and the lives of their family, and who were lucky enough to have joined that final airlift as the American embassy in the center of Saigon was abandoned. But even as we left from the embassy, we could see people gathering at the riverside, boarding all type and sort of tramp steamers and smaller boats, who began immediately to flee for their lives. And they were the first of hundreds of thousands over the next half-decade who would leave their country, their homeland, in desperation, seeking new lives abroad. 840,000 souls, Mr. Speaker, fled Vietnam in the mid to late 1970s, following the fall of Saigon, seeking refuge and seeking new homes. In her Governor General's award-winning novel, Rue, you may recall Kim T described in vivid detail the experience of these Vietnamese refugees escaping by boat to an uncertain future, something that she herself had done as a child. And I'll quote briefly from her writing. She said, "Heaven and hell embraced in the belly of our boat, heaven promising a turning point in our lives, a new future, a new history. Hell, though, displayed our fears, fear of pirates, fear of starvation, fear of poisoning by biscuits soaked in motor oil, fear of running out of water, fear of being able to stand up, fear of having to urinate in the red pot that was passed from hand to hand, fear that the scabies on the baby's head was contagious, fear of never again setting foot on solid ground, fear of never again seeing the faces of our parents who were sitting in the darkness surrounded by 200 people." Ms. Thuy continues, "Before our boat had weighed anchor in the middle of the night on the shores of Roc Gia, most of the passengers had just one fear: fear of the communists, the reason for their flight. But as soon as the vessel was surrounded, encircled by the uniform blue horizon of the ocean, fear was transformed into a 100-faced monster who sawed off our legs and kept us from feeling the stiffness in our immobilized muscles. Now, Mr. Speaker, the reality is 250,000 people would not survive the difficult sea journey. They fell victim to illness, piracy, and dangerous seas. Those who did survive made their way to refugee camps in neighboring countries such as Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, Singapore, and Hong Kong, which created a massive humanitarian crisis. This crisis required action on a global scale, and the world responded. And so, with the aid of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, government officials began the process of resettling the refugees in a number of countries, including the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Australia, the United States, and yes, Canada. Of those that survived the perilous sea voyage, more than 60,000 were welcomed to Canada. Approximately 34,000 were privately sponsored, 26,000 were assisted by the Government of Canada. These people, these refugees, became known as the boat people. They were welcomed with open arms by communities, by religious congregations, and by the communities themselves. Canadians helped these newest arrivals in Canada to find jobs, to make lives for themselves, and to educate their children and their grandchildren. In fact, the outpouring of support here in Canada, Mr. Speaker, was so strong that the private sponsorship of refugees program became enshrined as a fundamental part of Canada's refugee resettlement program, a program whose strength is recognized still around the world. Today, there are over 220,000 Canadians of Vietnamese origin. They contribute to all aspects of Canadian life, culture, sport, the economy, academia. We value these contributions, and Canada must continue to acknowledge what the Vietnamese refugees of the 70s experienced to get here. But we must remember that April 30th was the trigger. The final capture by the South Vietnamese capital by the communist North Vietnamese was the beginning. And while there is sadness to be commemorated, and it is commemorated every year on April 30th, there is within the South Vietnamese community, and I've seen it regularly on the anniversary, there is joy, there is celebration at the new life that they found here in Canada. As a result, Mr. Speaker, of Canada's efforts in assisting the boat people, you will recall that the United Nations High Commission for Refugees awarded the people of Canada the Nansen Medal in 1986, the only time in history an entire country has received such recognition. To this day, Canada has one of the most fair and generous immigration and refugee systems in the world. In fact, Mr. Speaker, we welcome more resettled refugees than almost any other industrialized country in the world. On a per capita basis, Canada leads the way. So, in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to say the designation of April 30th as Journey to Freedom Day will be a significant day, I believe, for all Canadians, not just the Vietnamese Canadian community. It will be a fitting way as well to mark the eve of Asian Heritage Month, which, as you know, Mr. Speaker, we celebrate every year in the month of May. With the passage of the bill, April 30th will be a special day of commemoration for the Vietnamese Canadian community. All Canadians, Mr. Speaker, deserve a day to remember with pride their considerable efforts to show the world that we are a caring and truly compassionate nation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.
Resuming debate, reprise du débat, the honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I wanted to address what I think is a very important issue. No doubt, Mr. Speaker, that it bridges political parties inside the chamber as we really reflect in terms of Canada's great diversity. And the leader of the Liberal Party has often talked about one of Canada's greatest strengths is, in fact, our diversity. And this is something in which we can all be very proud of. We can take a look, for example, at issues surrounding the principle of multiculturalism, something in which Pierre Trudeau actually brought in a number of years back, Mr. Speaker, something in which has instilled a great sense of pride in all of us, whether it doesn't matter what region of the country we live in. Mr. Speaker, I can talk about a great Canadian that I know, and that I've had the honor to be able to present a medal to, Mr. Speaker, and that's Bovan Gayan, who was someone that I have known for many years. In fact, when I was first elected in 1988, one of the first elected into the Manitoba legislature, one of the very first events that I was actually invited to back then was at the Saigon Centre, which is a wonderful, beautiful housing complex in the heart of Winnipeg. And in that particular invitation, I was afforded, for the first time, the opportunity to meet Ba. And I tell you, Mr. Speaker, the education and the information that Ba, through the years, has provided to me in regards to the historical perspective of Vietnam, and in particular, the Vietnamese heritage here in Canada, is of great value. And I suspect that Ba, and along with many others, but I want to single out Ba, has done a tremendous job at sharing his heritage, not only with individuals such as myself, but with literally hundreds, if not thousands, of people, Mr. Speaker, over the years. I know consistently the Saigon housing complex will often have special events where I will see other politicians in attendance. I will see members of the public in attendance, recognizing the important role that this hub of activity through the years that has been created through the Saigon Centre has, in such a positive way, contributed. In fact, Mr. Speaker, one of the little parks just down the street, literally steps away from the Saigon Centre, is a park that is dedicated towards the boat people. Now, if you talk to Ba, you will find that he will share with you his story, and he too is one of the had the misfortune of having to get onto a boat, ultimately then travel to the Philippines, which ultimately allowed him to reside here in Canada, Mr. Speaker. And I look at Ba as an individual that has contributed so much to our society. He is, in fact, Mr. Speaker, ran in a provincial election, and at the time for a different political party in which I belong to, Mr. Speaker. But he has demanded a great deal of respect, not because he stands on a pedestal and requires it, but rather he demonstrates through leadership that there's a great sense of pride. He is a proud Canadian with a great deal of pride in his Vietnamese heritage. And this is why, when I look at the bill that we have before us, what really the bill is doing, and what I would suggest to members of the House that it is doing, it is saying that we need to cherish the Vietnamese heritage, and a big part of that heritage is, in fact, the boats, Mr. Speaker, that ultimately led to immigrants coming, or refugees, I should say, coming to Canada. And by designating a day, what we're really doing is we're affording the opportunity for individuals, whether they are of Vietnamese heritage or not, to be able to recognize the contributions and to reflect on the history, I would suggest to you, Mr. Speaker, of the Vietnamese community and the positive impact that they've had on the broader community. The potential, Mr. Speaker, has been realized in many, many different ways in the province and the city in which I call my home, Winnipeg, and that is in terms of just the social and economic well-beings of our communities and the manner in which our Canadian Vietnamese constituents and others have really contributed to our economy, to our social fabric. And we can see that in many different ways, Mr. Speaker, whether it is in our health industry, our manufacturing industry, in politics in different ways, Mr. Speaker, that the community has really built as other communities. And when I started talking about the diversity and our multicultural fabric, you get a very good sense of just how a community has done so exceptionally well in a relatively short period of time. This last summer, I had the privilege to travel actually with my daughter to Vietnam, Mr. Speaker, and what a wonderful experience that was. Just being able to experience firsthand a culture and a heritage in which many of the constituents in which I represent today inside this House can really identify with, that being the country of Vietnam. So when I look at the bill that we have before us today, what I choose to reflect on is the importance of the issue at hand, and just instill that whole the sense of pride that we should all have in terms of our Vietnamese community and how well it has done and how well it has overcome over the last number of years many different barriers that have been put into place. And I know through experience and talking with members from the community, the Vietnamese community, that they want to be able to see even that much more in terms of contributions and preservations of the heritage. I know for fact there was discussions about looking at streets and how we can have street improvements, at looking at parks and how we can have parks kind of reflect some of the rich heritage or how Canada's heritage has actually been enriched by our Vietnamese community. In the second reading, in listening to the debate, because I had the opportunity to participate in second reading on this bill, Mr. Speaker, I listened to many speeches in regards to the value of recognizing a day, and I appreciate all the individuals that have taken the time to be able to stand in their place and share with the House some reflections on a very important community, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward ultimately to the bill moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate. Reprise du débat. Is the House ready for the question? The question is on motion number 3. I assume that positive. Mr. Brachetti, seconded by Ms. May, move that Bill S-219 be amended by deleting Clause 2. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion? No. We'll try. All those in favor of the motion will please say yea. All those opposed will please say nay. Nay. Obviously, the nays have it. I declare motion number 3 defeated. Order. Mr. Adler, seconded by Mr. Kent, moves that Bill S-219, an act respecting the National Day of Commemoration of the Exodus of Vietnamese refugees and their acceptance in Canada after the fall of Saigon and the end of the Vietnam War, be concurred in at report stage. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion? Yes. Hearing no nays. I declare the motion carried. We go to when shall the bill be read a third time? Now? No. Mr. Mr. Adler, seconded by Mr. Kent, moves that Bill S-219, an act respecting the National Day of Commemoration of the Exodus of Vietnamese refugees and their acceptance in Canada after the fall of Saigon and the end of the Vietnam War, be now read a third time and do pass. Debate, débat. Nobody's going to debate it. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion? Carried.
Third reading of this bill, troisième lecture de ce projet de loi.
À l'ordre